Okay, I have my fabric here that I've cut that is 9 inches across. It's 9 inches wide, and the height of it is 8 inches. So 9 inches across, and then the height that I'm gonna make is 8 inches. So the outside of it, I've already cut. This is my velvet. The inside, I have a piece of cotton that I'm lining it with. So the velvet will be the outside. This cotton here will be the inside. This will be the piece that's towards my face. And then I've also cut the same size, some interfacing. So I have this cotton interfacing here, and it's a fusible interfacing, meaning it's smooth on one side, and then on the other side it has sort of this pebbled effect that will adhere to my velvet once I press it. And so what that'll do is just give the velvet a little bit more shape so that I can work with it easier. And it also acts as a bit of a filter for me. So I'll take the pebbled side of my interfacing here, the wrong side of my interfacing, and I'm going to press it to the wrong side of my velvet here. Okay, I've applied my fusible interfacing to the wrong side of my velvet. And if you don't have fusible interfacing, if you have sew-on, go ahead and do a basting stitch to sew your interfacing on. And then I have my 2 strips of elastic that are 6 inches long. Mine just happens to be 1/8 of an inch because I like the thinner elastic. If yours is a little wider, say 1/4 of an inch, that's perfectly fine. Just cut yourself 2 strips that are 6 inches, okay? And then with velvet fabric, velvet has a nap, meaning a one-way design. And so what I mean by that is with velvet especially, you can tell with this crushed velvet, if I run my hand that way, it's a smooth surface. If I go that way, it's rougher. Depending on what you're making, if you're doing something with velvet, you want to make sure you lay everything out the same way because it will look different. Your fabric will look different in color depending upon which way you lay it, okay? So this way, it feels really smooth. If I were to turn it, it feels really rough if I run my hand across it. And you can see it looks shinier here versus this way, okay? It's more of a black color here. So I want it this way. So just pay attention to that. If you say happen to be making something else, you want to make sure you lay everything out the proper way so that all of your fabric looks the same, okay? So what I want to do now is just apply my elastic. I'll go ahead and attach my elastic. So what I'm going to do with this, I've allowed myself a 1/2 of an inch seam allowance. So I am going to measure down from the top edge 1/2 of an inch. And I'll put myself a pin there because that's where I'm attaching my elastic. Okay, and then I want to measure a 1/2 of an inch from the bottom. Okay, I have my markings for my elastic, and what I'm going to do is stitch it in place by hand first. Because it's so thin, it tends to get stuck down in your sewing machine. So I'll do it by hand first and then come back and do it on the sewing machine. Okay, so just want to line that up. And I'll do myself a few stitches here by hand just to hold it in place for me. And my thread is purple, no worries. I just grabbed what I happen to have already threaded. But once I sew it, you won't even see the thread. You want to do this in all 4 places where your elastic is. Okay, I've stitched my elastic in place by hand on all 4 sides here. And so at this point, what I would do, like I know this is good for me, but for someone else, if you're making this, what I would suggest is put this over your face. Put this over your mouth, put this behind your ears before we completely finish it up, and make sure this is a comfortable fit for you. If you find that this is too loose, it's a little too big, what you can do is where I gave myself, I'm allowing myself 1/2 of an inch seam allowance, you can just make your seam allowance a little bigger. So if I'm gonna come in 1/2 of an inch, maybe you come in 5/8 of an inch on all sides, just so you make this a little shorter. So try it on if you are comfortable with the fit. Okay, like I said, I'm fine with the fit. So what I'll do now is just stitch my elastic in place so that it's a permanent stitch here. Well, semi-permanent, because you could always take it out if you needed to. But I'm going to stitch it in place on my sewing machine. Okay, so just stitch on all 4 sides. Okay, I have my elastic sewn on in all 4 corners. So now I'll just apply my lining. So with the right sides together, this is, obviously the right side. With the lining, you can't really tell, it doesn't matter. So I'll pin it in place and I will stitch all the way around, leaving myself an opening so that I can turn it to the right side. So I'll leave my opening at the bottom here, or probably about, 2 or 3 inch opening, just enough for me to get my hand in here and turn it to the right side. Just want to go straight forward. Okay, and I'm just checking my elastic. I want to make sure it's straight that way and I don't accidentally sew it with it, caught up in my seam here. So just push it out of your way there, and you can kind of feel for it and make sure you don't have your elastic up there. Okay, and my opening is here. Okay, what I'm going to do is just trim these corners here. I'm going to cut across, cutting that triangle off so that it will lay nice and flat once I turn it. And I'll give my seam allowances a bit of a trim so that it's more 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. I just want a very narrow seam allowance here because we're going to have to come back and make pleats here, and I don't want to have to make it over all this fabric. So I'll trim it to a nice thin seam allowance. And with your opening, just turn it to the right hand side. Okay, so you at this point can go to the ironing board and give this a good press. Your opening here, you want to turn in your seam allowances, and I'll probably just do a slip stitch by hand to stitch it closed. So it just depends upon what you want. You can finish it a couple different ways. Find a pin here. I will slip stitch mine because I don't want a top stitch here. Okay, so I'm just going to do a hand stitch to close this. You can go to your ironing board and press it, and you can do just a top stitch, a narrow edge stitch all the way around if you want to, and then that will close that up for you. Okay, so I've closed my opening. Now we do the pleats. Okay, and for our pleats, I've seen those videos where they have it marked for you. The pleats are evenly spaced and it lets you know how much to measure down in order to make your pleat. I just tend to estimate it because if I don't like it, I'll just take my pins out and redo it. So this will be my first pleat. I'll fold it down a bit there. Okay, and I'll put a pin here to hold that in place for me. That's my first one. Okay, my second pleat. Let's see, probably about like that. Okay, and then my third pleat. Oh, let's say it looks something like this. Okay, so I got one side done, and then I just use this side and make the other side look like it. Okay, So here are my pleats. This is what they're gonna look like. And once I get them, you know, everything pinned in place, because I might need to make some adjustments, I'll actually measure it and let you know what I did. Then, so once it's sewn, it will look like this. Okay, so my pleats are, find a ruler. So I have roughly about 1/2 inch wide pleats. So now that I have this pinned, what we're gonna do is actually sew this in place. So I'll start at the top and sew down, and then on this side, I'll sew down. We're sewing our pleats in place. Okay, I have my pleats pinned into place. I'll get it under my sewing machine, and I'm actually gonna start sewing about here in the middle here, in the middle of my first pleat, so that I'm able to pull it a little bit, and then I'll come back and stitch the other way. Okay. Just make sure that's under there. And I'm just gonna stitch close to the edge here. Okay, turn my needle to make sure that's where I want it. Okay. Okay, I'll do a back stitch. Okay, I'm going to turn it the other way so that I can get the rest of my top pleat here. And my pressure foot, you know, it's in the down position, and I lift it. It's still, I want it to go up a little higher, so I'm just going to take my hook here that raises it, my lever that raises it, and pull it up a little bit more. Okay, so that I can position it where I want it to be. Okay, go sew your other side the same way. Is your completed mask. Okay, for my headband, I need 2 strips of fabric that are roughly 24 inches long and 8 inches wide. Okay, I have my 2 pieces of fabric. It's 24 inches the long way, and they're both 8 inches wide. So what I'm gonna do is fold them in half the long way with my right sides together, and I'll just stitch along the cut edge here. So I'm creating 2 tubes. Okay, I'm gonna fold it in half, right sides together, and stitch this long edge. And I'm actually going to use a zigzag stitch because my fabric stretches, and if I use a zigzag stitch, that will stretch a bit more with the fabric versus if I were to do just a straight stitch. So just match up my edges here, switch to a zigzag stitch. Okay, now that you've sewn both tubes, you want to take them and turn them both to the right-hand side. Much quicker. Okay. Now what you do is lay your tube down, lay one of them down with the seam side up. So here's my seam, and I want my seam in the middle here. Okay, so center it as much as you can, and lay it down. So say we'll lay it that way. And you take your other one, you do the same thing. Line it up so that your seam is in the middle here. Okay. And then you want to place it over the other one across. Like try to find the center of here. Like I said, I always just sort of eyeball stuff. So I'm going, that looks about center. So I want to find the center of there and place my other one on top of it, matching my seams up. So I have seam to seam and place it across. So you should have one going vertically and one going horizontally. Then at this point, what you would do is pull your two pieces either side. So this is my vertical piece. I'm going to pull and pin. And I'm just going to pin it for now. I can make any adjustments that I need once I get this in place. And then take your other one and pin it. Got off a little bit, so let me find my center again, okay? Okay, and then pin these two. Okay, so it should look like this, right? And then what you would do, you just bring them all together and you would sew a stitch sewing all four pieces together. At this point, what you want to do, you would sew a stitch sewing all four pieces together. And if you want to, what you can do is put a safety pin here and try it on first and see how it feels so that you can determine your seam allowance. So you know if you need like a really narrow seam allowance or if you're okay to stitch over here, you know, about 5/8 of an inch away. Okay, I've lined up my edges here as much as I can, you know. So make sure I'm even up there, and then I made sure, you know, I'm even down here. Okay, and then everything else, if I'm a little bit off, I'll just sort of stretch it to fit. And make sure I take this pin out, place it this way. And you just want to make a stitch through all four layers. Okay, so I stitched through all four layers. It looks like this is your back seam here. And I'm off a little bit here. I could undo this piece here and just stretch it to fit, but that doesn't bother me. If you're concerned at all about that, just undo your stitching. I think I will just to show you. So you would undo some stitching here and just stretch the one on my right side here to fit. Okay, I took some of this stitching out here. So what you could do to make sure it's really even across the top is just pin it in place, because once you're sewing, it tends to move around a bit. Okay, so pin it in place and decide whether or not you like that. And then stitch it in place by hand. Okay, so do a basting stitch and then you can come back and sew it on your machine. I have purple here, but I'm going to pull it right out. It doesn't matter. It's just a temporary stitch to hold this in place for me. Okay, let's see how that looks. Yeah, see how that looks straighter over there? The edges are even. So probably, you know, especially if you're doing this as a gift for someone, I would stitch it in place by hand. Even if you just do the ends of it, stitch it in place by hand and then come back and do it on the sewing machine. It's temporary basting stitch to get it to where you want it, and then come back and do it on the sewing machine. So that looks better. Okay, so I'm going to leave my pin in until I get it in my machine. Okay, and this is your completed headband.